So in this video, we're going to be talking about two sectors that exist in most economies. It's the public sector and the private sector. And the size of these sectors depends on the type of system. So we're looking at who's providing the goods and services. We're going to look at what does that mean and some of the pros and cons associated with that. So when you hear people talk about the public sector, what they're talking about are the goods and services that are provided by the government. So that's the first important part of this is that anything that is coming from the government fits into this public sector. If it's owned by the government, if it's controlled by the government, it is a public good. It's a public service. And the second part to this that's important is that it's free of cost to the users. So that doesn't mean it doesn't cost any money to fund. It doesn't mean that people that work in these programs are doing so with no salary. All that means is that when you use that good or service, you're not getting a bill for it. You don't have to pay for it to get access to it. So there is a cost to it. You still have to pay taxes, and then that tax dollar gets used to fund these programs here. So, for example, in a free market system, we talked about the fact that if you want roads to drive on, you have to create them yourselves and you have to maintain them yourself. And so you would charge people to drive on those roads so that you had the funds to fix them. In things that are in the public sector, then it wouldn't be individuals providing roads, it would be the government providing roads. And so they would take tax dollars, pay for those roads, and then you don't have to get charged to drive on them, at least in most cases, right? So you're not getting an actual bill to use those services and those goods. So two things that have to exist in order for something to be considered a public good or service or in the public sector is one that it has to be non-rival or non-rivalrous, meaning that if you use that good or service, it doesn't take away from somebody else's ability to use that thing. So, for example, if I walk down the sidewalk out in front of the school, that doesn't mean that sidewalk is gone because I walked on it. It is still there, still available for anyone else to walk on. That makes it non-rival. If it's something that you can look at, that you can use, and then that is then available to someone else, that fits in this category. The second qualification is that has to be non-excludable, which means everyone has access to this thing, right? You don't have to pay to walk on the sidewalks. You don't have to be a certain type of person to walk on the sidewalks. Anybody that is in the area that wants to walk on the sidewalk is able to do so. Okay, so those two things are important for whether or not something qualifies as being a public good or a public service, right? And whether it fits into this public sector here. Anytime you hear something is being nationalized, that means it is falling now under the control of the government, which means we're taking something that was privately owned and we're now letting the government control it. So if we nationalize healthcare, that means we're no longer going to have privately owned hospitals or privately owned insurance. It's all going to be provided and managed and funded by the government. Okay, so some examples here of things that we currently have or could be public fit in this public sector are our laws, our maintaining of laws, so police, fire, court systems, those are all would be public goods. Your parks, your roads, your libraries, your schools, your sidewalks, the street lighting, a lot of the infrastructure, like anything that would be fit under that non-rival and non-excludable would fit in this category here. And again, it's something that the government is controlling and making decisions for and funding. Okay. On the other hand, you have the private sector. Okay. So this would be anything, any goods or services that are provided by privately owned companies, right? Now, that also means corporations. Now, corporations are publicly traded, which means they have stocks on the stock market, but they're still considered to fall in the private sector since they're not owned by the government. Okay. So it gets a little bit tricky since they're called publicly traded companies, but they're in the private sector. Okay, so again, if you decide to go out and open a business, you put your money into it. It is your business. You get to make the decisions with that business for the most part. So systems that have a large private sector tend to have more economic freedom because they're allowing individuals to make the decisions for their businesses on themselves. Okay, now in order for something, or if you're in the private sector, typically you are providing a good or service that we would consider rival, right? Which means you're selling a product, and when somebody buys that product or buys that service, that means no one else is able to enjoy that, right? Because it's used up. Now, it's not always that way, but in most cases, these products are going to be rivalrous, right? You buying it takes away somebody else's ability to have access to it. The other qualification would be excludable, right? It's not, these products are not available to everyone. If you go into Walmart, you can't just walk out with whatever you want because you have to pay for it first. That makes those products excludable. There's something you have to do before you get access to that product. Okay. So pretty much opposite of the public sector in this aspect here. Private sector, their goal is to make money, right? These businesses exist to make money and to provide goods and services for those people that can afford it. If you hear something is being privatized, that means it is going from government control to now being privately controlled and owned, right? So let's say we privatized the military. That means it was no longer being funded for by the government. There would be some public company, or sorry, some private company owning those soldiers and making decisions for them and owning the equipment. And then they would get to decide when and where to send troops, and it would not be under the decision of the government because they're not in control anymore, right? And so that private sector means that those choices fall to those privately and individuals that own the companies. Pretty much all your goods and services that you have to pay for would fit into the private sector. At least here in the United States, this is the majority of the things that we get come from the private sector. Now, not all systems look like that. The more government control you ask for and more government security, the bigger the public sector and the smaller the private sector. So it looks different in every system, but those are pretty much what those are. Now, the question comes down to, for these economic systems we're about to get into, who is the best group to make the decisions and who should be providing these goods and services? Some people think that it's the government, and some people think that it's privately owned companies. So if you're on the side of the government and that they would be the best option to provide goods and services, that usually means you value the economic equity and you're looking at fairness, is that everybody gets access to it and you shouldn't have to pay to get certain things. You're going to see a lot more taxes in those types of systems where they want the government to provide more. They need more money to fund that. So you're going to be taxed more, which means less money for individuals and less money for businesses. But then that money will come from elsewhere. If the government is the one providing things, that means they get to make the decisions about those products, right? So if they're providing healthcare, they get to decide what that looks like and who gets access to it, and how many doctors and how many surgeries those doctors can do, or what medicine they're allowed to give out for certain things. That is all the government that gets to decide those kinds of things. People that are on the side that's saying, hey, we think privately owned companies are the better option, would tend to be more economic freedom on the side of those things. You would see your products would be better quality. There would be more of them. There would be more innovation because they're being rewarded for those things. If the government's providing it, there's not that reward there because they're not making profit off of it. And so they have no interest in making those things better, right? So privately owned companies, that if you have a bigger private sector, you tend to see those things happening. But that does also mean that some people are going to be left out because those products are excludable, meaning you have to pay for them in order to get access to them, which means not everybody's going to get access, right? And so the question then comes down to, again, who should be in control? Now, a big thing in economics here is this idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? Which means for those things that are publicly provided, you're not paying for them. And so you want to get as much out of it as you possibly can. Right. And you don't care about it being used up. You don't care about those resources or those products being used up because you want to take as much as you possibly can. Right. And that's not good because eventually then those resources, those products are just gone. Because there's a limited amount of them and the government can't just constantly be providing more. Nobody's looking out for the overall interest of everyone or prolonging those resources or goods because you're just in it to get as much as you can. Right now, if it's privately owned, you tend to be wanting to preserve those resources because you want them to last longer so that you can continue saving them, continue using them, continue making profit off of them. And so you tend to be more careful on how they're used, how much you're using it, the availability that's there, right? So when we look at these systems, that's really one of the big questions that's being asked is, should we be more publicly controlled or more privately controlled? And that's one of the big reasons that separates these systems out. All right, go ahead and go back to the agenda to see what your next activity is.